Have you ever wondered what really drives the foreign policy decisions of the United States? Especially, when it comes to really complex, highly contested regions like the Middle East,
Hmm.
or maybe you've come across a piece of writing and academic work that just seem to, well, detonate with such force, as one commentator put it,
Yeah.
right from the moment it appeared.
Absolutely. That phrase, detonate with such force, it comes from Michael Massing, writing in the New York Review of Books. He was observing, and I think this is key, that not since Foreign Affairs magazine published Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations has an academic essay detonated with such force.
Wow. Comparing it to Huntington. That really underscores how significant this was. It wasn't just another paper.
Yeah.
It immediately sparked this huge debate, right?
Exactly. A huge, intense, sometimes very emotional response across the board, academic, political, public.
And that initial essay, it caused such a stir that the authors, John Mearheimer and Stephen Walt, felt they needed to expand on it, right? Turn it into a full book.
That's right. And today, that's the book we're going to explore. The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. They published this much larger study, partly to elaborate on their original arguments, sure, but also very specifically to respond to the just torrent of criticism that first essay received.
So it was a response, in a way.
It was, and they acknowledged, while they felt many personal attacks were unfair, they also said they genuinely learned from some of the thoughtful, substantive critiques. They aimed to address those points in the book, incorporate them where they could, even if they weren't, fully persuaded by every counter-argument.
So building on it, refining things based on the feedback.
Precisely. Framing it as an academic response within a very public, often very heated debate. It's kind of unusual, actually, to see a work evolve so directly in conversation with its critics like that. Shows a real commitment to engaging, I think.
And our mission for you today is to carefully and impartially walk you through this book's central arguments. We want to look at the evidence the authors present and the, sometimes controversial conclusions they draw.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal is just to help you fully grasp what Mearheimer and Walt were setting out to do. We'll present the information clearly, try to connect the dots for you on what is, let's face it, a complex and often very sensitive topic. And everything we discuss comes straight from the pages of the book itself, so you can form your own informed perspective.
Okay.
So let's get into it. The book really kicks off by documenting the sheer scale and the unique nature of U.S. support for Israel.
Right.
They quote former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin back in 1994, describing this relationship as, quote, beyond compare in modern history.
That statement alone, coming from Rabin, it sets a powerful tone, doesn't it? Highlights just how exceptional this relationship is seen, even from the Israeli side, before the authors even start their analysis.
Absolutely. And what's really striking, as the book details it, is just the sheer volume and, maybe more importantly, the consistency of the aid Israel has received over decades.
Yeah, the consistency is key. Since 1976, the book points out, Israel has been the largest annual recipient of U.S. foreign assistance every single year.
Largest recipient.
Largest. This isn't just about, big one-off payments. It's a long-term, established pattern of exceptional generosity that really sets Israel apart from pretty much every other nation getting American aid.
And the numbers they lay out, they really drive that home. The book specifies Israel receives, on average, about $3 billion in direct foreign assistance annually.
$3 billion a year.
Which, to put that in perspective for you, that figure alone is roughly 1/6 of America's entire direct foreign assistance budget.
1/6. Think about that. All the global needs, all the countries the U.S. aids. A huge slice goes to this one nation.
It's substantial.
Hugely. And then when you break it down per person, per capita, the scale becomes even more, stark. It highlights the extraordinary nature of this commitment. We're talking over $500 per year for every single Israeli citizen.
$500 per person.
Per person per year. Now let's compare that for a second. Egypt, right? The second largest recipient in total dollars gets about $20 per person.
$20.
20. And if you look at really impoverished countries, places like Pakistan or Haiti, they get maybe $5, maybe $27 per person, respectively. It just puts the scale of U.S. aid to Israel into this stark, kind of unparalleled perspective.
It really does.
It suggests a level of aid far beyond what many truly struggling nations receive, which immediately makes the authors ask, well, why? What's the rationale here?
Exactly. It begs the question. And the book also points out a significant shift in the type of aid over time. It wasn't always like this.
Right. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, U.S. support changed dramatically. It shifted from being primarily loans, which, theoretically get repaid, to direct grants.
So basically gifts.
Essentially gifts, yes.
Yeah.
And furthermore, the focus changed too. Military assistance now makes up about 75% of that total aid package.
So not just money for general purposes, but specifically military hardware, tech support, security assistance, directly boosting Israel's defense capabilities.
Correct. And it's not just the regular annual aid either. The book highlights how willing Congress seems to be to provide additional supplemental aid packages, often tied to specific political or military events.
Like extra funding on top of the usual billions.
Exactly. For instance, they detail an extra $1.2 billion for the 1998 Wye River Agreement that was a peace accord, and another $1 billion in 2003 specifically to help Israel prepare for the potential fallout from the Iraq War. This shows this deep, ongoing commitment that goes beyond just standard budgets. It's a responsive, flexible flow of resources that seems almost unique in U.S. foreign policy.
And what makes this largesse especially striking, as the authors put it in the book, is that Israel, unlike maybe more traditional aid recipients we think of like Afghanistan or somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, is, quote, not a poor or devastated country.
Right. It's a highly industrialized, modern nation, robust economy, which kind of challenges the usual assumption that foreign aid is mainly for, humanitarian relief or basic economic development in struggling places.
Yeah, it's not a developing nation in that sense.
Not at all. And the book gives specific economic indicators to back this up. It cites that back in 2006, Israel's per capita income ranked 29th in the world. That's nearly double countries like Hungary or the Czech Republic, and substantially higher than, say, Portugal, South Korea, or Taiwan.
29th in the world.
And it ranked 23rd in the UN's 2006 Human Development Report. That's a broad measure of well-being. They even note that some really strong pro-Israel supporters, people like Mitchell Bard and Daniel Pipes, have openly acknowledged Israel's relative affluence.
Interesting.
So this prosperity, according to the authors, it fundamentally challenges that conventional wisdom about aid being driven by need. It suggests there's something else going on here, prompting the book to dig deeper into what the real drivers might be.
Okay, so beyond the money, the book describes this deep, very extensive military and intelligence relationship. It formalizes the U.S. commitment to Israel's security. It's clearly not just aid flowing one way.
No, it's a comprehensive security partnership. And what's fascinating is how it became institutionalized over time through these strategic agreements, like the 1981 Memorandum of Understanding.
Right, you mentioned that.
Yeah, it set up this broad framework for continued consultation and cooperation. And that led to specific groups like the Joint Security Assistance Planning Group, or JSAP.
JSAP.
This group regularly reviews Israeli aid requests, coordinates military plans, even oversees joint exercises. This level of institutionalized cooperation, it goes way beyond what the U.S. typically has, even with many other close allies. It signals a really profound integration of security interests.
And intelligence sharing too, right? The book mentions that.
Significant intelligence cooperation, yes, between Mossad, Israel's agency, and the CIA. They quote an Israeli intelligence expert, Ephraim Kahana, highlighting what he termed Mossad-CIA cooperation, suggests a remarkable level of trust, really, intimacy at the highest levels of national security, exchanging highly sensitive information routinely.
Okay, but then there's a particularly sensitive point the authors raise. The U.S. handling of Israel's nuclear program. That seems revealing.
Extremely revealing. The book details how, despite U.S. officials in the State Department, the CIA being highly suspicious about Israel's nuclear ambitions and, frankly, its secret development efforts.
They knew something was up.
They strongly suspected, but the Johnson administration made a very conscious decision not to confront Israel directly about it.
Why not?
Well, the fear, according to the book, was twofold. Either a confrontation would push Israel to just end the limited inspections that were happening, or maybe more broadly, it would jeopardize the whole U.S. commitment to Israel's security, which Washington was becoming increasingly hesitant to do.
And the book cites that really eye-opening detail about President Johnson.
Yes. Reportedly telling CIA Director Richard Helms back in 1968 to make sure nobody else saw evidence of Israel getting the bomb, explicitly saying, quote, "I did not want to know."
I did not want to know. That's quite something.
It is, and it raises a huge question for you, the listener. What kind of relationship allows a superpower to deliberately turn a blind eye to something as critical as nuclear proliferation by an ally.
Right. Something that would normally trigger alarms everywhere.
Exactly. It implies this unique, almost deferential posture by the U.S., where potentially major concerns about an ally's actions were seemingly pushed aside to just maintain the relationship at all costs.
And related to that, the book argues that all this generosity, this often unconditional support, hasn't actually given Washington much leverage over Israel's behavior, which is kind of counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive. In most relationships, aid is a tool, right? You can use it to influence behavior, get concessions. But the authors argue here it's different. Instead of using threats to withhold aid, the sticks cooperation from Israel is usually obtained through additional carrots.
More aid, more incentives.
Yeah, exactly. Increased assistance, other diplomatic goodies, military upgrades. It suggests this dynamic where the U.S. is constantly giving more to get compliance, rather than using the existing aid as leverage.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
It flips the usual power dynamic. Can you give an example from the book?
Sure. The book details how the Israeli cabinet only agreed to publicly endorse UN Resolution 242, the one calling for withdrawal from territories seized in '67 after President Nixon guaranteed them additional U.S. aircraft.
So the planes came first.
The guarantee did, yes. And similarly, Israel's acceptance of the ceasefire that ended the war of attrition with Egypt, that was also apparently bought by a U.S. pledge to speed up aircraft deliveries and provide advanced electronic countermeasures.
So it's a consistent pattern.
The authors argue it is. This pattern suggests U.S. aid often functions as a reward or even a precondition for Israel taking certain actions rather than a tool the U.S. uses to influence policy or impose conditions. It fundamentally changes that typical donor-recipient dynamic.
Okay, so we have massive financial aid, deep military and intelligence ties, and maybe surprisingly little leverage in return. What about diplomatic protection?
Ah, yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the U.S. provides incredibly consistent, almost unparalleled diplomatic protection for Israel, particularly at the United Nations.
Veto power.
The veto power is the most obvious manifestation, yes. It's a clear, documented pattern of shielding Israel from international criticism, blocking resolutions that might otherwise hold it accountable on the global stage.
And the book gives numbers on that, right?
It does. Between 1972 and 2006, Washington vetoed, wait for it, 42 UN Security Council resolutions critical of Israel.
42.
42. That number is more than all the other permanent members of the Security Council combined during that same period.
Wow.
And it amounts to slightly over half of all American vetoes cast during those years. The U.S. consistently acts as this diplomatic shield.
It's undeniable.
And it's not just casting vetoes. The U.S. often prevents critical resolutions from even reaching a formal vote simply by threatening a veto.
Preempting the criticism.
Exactly. The book recalls an instance in 2002 where the U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Negroponte, reportedly told a closed Security Council meeting the U.S. would veto any resolution condemning Israel unless it also explicitly condemned terrorism generally and specifically named groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas.
So setting conditions that make passage impossible.
Right. It's not just voting no, it's actively shaping the agenda, setting the terms of the debate, effectively shutting down unwanted criticism before it even gets formalized.
The book also talks about the U.S. stance before the Six-Day War in 1967. It wasn't always full-throated support for action, was it?
No, initially it was more cautious. President Johnson, the book recounts, first tried to restrain Israel from launching a preemptive strike against its Arab neighbors. Urged restraint, looked for diplomatic options.
But that changed?
It did. The book details how Johnson ultimately gave what one expert later termed a yellow light for an attack, basically implicitly assuring Israel that the U.S. wouldn't object if Israel acted on its own.
Sort of tacit approval.
Tacit approval, yes. It hints at this nuanced shifting dynamic where maybe initial reluctance gave way, perhaps under pressure, perhaps due to a calculation that Israel was going to act anyway and non-objection was the best path.
Interesting. And even later, during the diplomacy after the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
Even then, during that complex step-by-step diplomacy aimed at disengaging forces and maybe finding peace, the U.S. consistently worked to protect Israel's interests.
How so?
Well, a crucial example is the pledge the U.S. made not to recognize or negotiate with the PLO as long as the PLO didn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Congress later actually wrote that pledge into law. And Dennis Ross, who was a key U.S. negotiator in the Middle East for years under Clinton, he put it very candidly, as quoted in the book. Far too often, we functioned as Israel's lawyer.
Israel's lawyer. That's a strong statement from a top negotiator.
It is, and it highlights this perceived advocacy role the U.S. often played, aligning American policy squarely with Israeli positions, rather than acting, perhaps, as a more neutral mediator trying to bridge gaps.
So, summing up this section, the book quotes Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to Congress in 1996, saying the U.S. has given Israel munificent and magnificent assistance. And he finished with, "Thank you, people of America."
Right. And the fact that, as the book notes, since 1976, 6 different Israeli leaders have addressed joint sessions of Congress. That's more than any other country.
More than any other country?
More than any other. Especially when you remember, Israel's population is smaller than New York City's. This extraordinary level of access, this gratitude, it just underscores the uniquely privileged position Israel holds among U.S. allies.
It paints a picture of a truly exceptional relationship.
Undeniably.
Okay, so given all that the aid, the military ties, the diplomatic cover, what does the book say this means for U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah.
This is where it starts to challenge things, right?
This is where it really pivots to challenge the conventional wisdom, yes. Mearsheimer and Walt argue that the usual justifications given for this extensive support, the strategic reasons, the moral reasons are, in their view, either outdated, based on flawed assumptions, or just plain wrong.
So they're asking you, the listener, to critically re-examine the core reasons often given for this special relationship.
Exactly, to prompt a deep reevaluation of beliefs that are often taken for granted.
Let's start with a strategic argument. The idea that supporting Israel makes America safer, stronger in the Middle East. That's a common refrain.
It's probably the core strategic argument you hear most often in policy circles. But the book contends this view is, quote, at best outdated and at worst simply wrong.
Strong words.
Very strong. It rigorously scrutinizes whether Israel genuinely serves as a strategic asset for the U.S. today, especially in the post-Cold War world. The author suggests the strategic calculus has changed dramatically, and the benefits once claimed might not apply anymore, or maybe never fully did.
And they look back historically.
Yeah.
Because wasn't there some initial skepticism?
There was. The book takes us back to 1948, and it's quite revealing. Many top U.S. policymakers and people like Secretary of State George Marshall, the influential George Kennan, they actually saw the creation of Israel not as an asset, but as a potential liability.
A liability.
Their main fear was that committing to Israel would jeopardize crucial U.S. relations with the Arab world, which had oil and strategic locations, and, critically, that it might open the door for Soviet influence in the region, dragging the U.S. into conflicts it wanted to avoid.
So the strategic thinkers were wary.
They were. The book suggests President Truman's final decision to support Israel was driven more by, genuine sympathy for Jewish suffering post-Holocaust, perhaps some religious conviction, and definitely a shrewd awareness of the domestic political benefits, rather than clear strategic imperatives. This initial skepticism is a key detail the book highlights, contrasting sharply with later justifications.
What about during the Cold War, though? Did Israel serve as an asset then against the Soviets?
The authors acknowledge that Israel may have been a net strategic asset during certain periods of the Cold War. For instance, it did act as a check against Soviet client states like Egypt and Syria at times. But, they argue, this came with significant costs. They contend that the very strength of the U.S.-Israel bond by alienating Arab states actually played a major role in pushing those same states into Moscow's arms in the first place, because they couldn't get support or weapons from Washington.
Ah, so it's a double-edged sword.
Kind of. Israel helped check Soviet influence in one way, but simultaneously, the relationship arguably fueled the need for that checking by driving Arab states towards the Soviets. A complex and costly dynamic for the U.S., according to the book.
Okay, but here's where it gets, as you said, really interesting. The book claims that after the Cold War ended, Israel's strategic value dropped sharply. And it actually became, in their view, a strategic liability.
That's the core of their post-Cold War argument, a liability. They argue that strong, unconditional U.S. backing for Israel fuels anti-Americanism in the Middle East, making the U.S. less safe, not more.
That directly contradicts the common argument.
It completely flips it. And it's a provocative claim, no doubt.
How do they support that? That's a big claim.
They draw on some very sensitive material. For example, the findings of the 9/11 Commission. The commission's staff statement noted that Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda were motivated by both Israel's treatment of Palestinians and, crucially, by U.S. support for Israel.
So a direct link.
A direct link asserted by the commission. The book emphasizes that bin Laden apparently tried to speed up the 9/11 attacks after Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, specifically to punish the U.S. for its perceived unwavering support for Israel.
And didn't bin Laden initially target the capital?
Yes, the book points that out. He initially targeted the U.S. Capitol, seeing as, quote, the perceived source of U.S. policy in support of Israel. This direct connection, drawn by the book from the Commission's work, links a catastrophic national security event squarely to U.S. policy towards Israel. It asserts a profound and incredibly costly implication.
That is powerful and disturbing. And the authors argue it's not just bin Laden, right? It's a broader sentiment.
Yes, they argue it's much broader. They cite surveys showing pervasive anti-American feeling across the Muslim world, and that this sentiment is often deeply and directly linked to the Palestinian issue. They quote Shibli Talhami, a respected Middle East expert, saying, "No other issue resonates with the public in the Arab world more deeply than Palestine."
Suggesting a widespread, deeply felt grievance.
Exactly. And this widespread anti-Americanism, the authors argue, then makes it much harder for the U.S. to get cooperation from countries in the region on other critical issues like fighting terrorism or even promoting democracy.
It complicates everything else.
It does. The book mentions letters from dozens of former British and American diplomats criticizing what they saw as one-sided and illegal U.S. policies. Even prominent Israelis, like the military correspondent Ze'ev Schiff, are quoted recognizing that the conflict and occupation fuel terror.
And the Iraq Study Group.
Right. The bipartisan Iraq Study Group in 2006 concluded that the U.S. can't achieve its goals in the Middle East unless it directly addresses the Arab-Israeli conflict. All these points, highlighted in the book, reinforce their argument that the road to broader U.S. security in the region, perhaps even the road to Baghdad, really runs through Jerusalem.
Okay, what about the argument that Israel is a bulwark against nuclear threats, protecting the region and, by extension, the U.S. from rogue states getting the bomb?
The book questions that, too. It notes that both the U.S. and Israel themselves have powerful nuclear deterrents.
Mutually assured destruction, basically.
Essentially, yes. The authors argue that if either country were attacked with nuclear weapons, the attacker would face devastating suicidal retaliation. This makes nuclear blackmail irrational. They draw a parallel to the Cold War. The Soviet Union, with thousands of nukes, couldn't blackmail the U.S. because the U.S. could retaliate credibly.
So the threat might be overstated.
They suggest the nuclear threat to Israel from smaller states might be significantly overstated as a justification for U.S. support, given Israel's own robust deterrent capability.
Now, the book also touches on some problematic behavior by Israel as an ally, casting a shadow on the relationship.
Yes, it does. It alleges, for instance, that Israel has, on occasion, sold American weapons technology to third countries, including potential adversaries like China, and transferred other sensitive U.S. tech without permission.
Really? Selling U.S. tech?
That's the allegation. The book cites a 1992 State Department Inspector General's report that supposedly found evidence of a systematic and growing pattern of unauthorized transfers by Israel.
If true, that obviously raises serious questions about security and trust.
Absolutely. And even more worrying, the book claims ongoing Israeli efforts to steal American military secrets. Espionage.
Yes, espionage. The most famous example highlighted starkly in the book is the case of Jonathan Pollard.
Right, the American intelligence analyst. That's exactly. Who gave Israel massive amounts of highly classified U.S. material between 1981 and 1985. And the book underscores that even after Pollard was caught, the Israelis apparently refused to tell the U.S. exactly what information he'd given them, making it impossible for U.S. intelligence to fully assess the damage.
That's damaging to the relationship, surely.
You'd think so. But the book portrays the Pollard case as just the most visible tip of a larger iceberg, implying a much broader pattern of Israeli spying against the U.S.
Like what?
It details other alleged incidents, Israeli agents trying to steal spy camera technology, trying to recruit a senior U.S. counterterrorism official, and they quote John David, former head of the Justice Department's Internal Security Section, saying in the Wall Street Journal that people in counterespionage regarded Israel as the second most active foreign intelligence service in the United States, second only to Russia.
Second only to Russia.
That's the quote cited. It paints this picture of an ally engaging in activities that are highly problematic for U.S. national security and trust, which certainly challenges the narrative of a totally harmonious, cooperative relationship.
Okay, so that covers the strategic arguments. What about the moral justifications for supporting Israel? The book tackles those too, right?
It does rigorously. It questions the common narratives about Israel's founding, its conduct in wars, its treatment of minorities. Essentially, it asks you to consider what the authors call a new history of the region, one that often diverges quite sharply from the more widely accepted versions.
A new history. Where does that come from?
It's a term Mearsheimer and Walt use, but it draws heavily on the work of Israeli scholars themselves, often called the new historians. This scholarship directly challenges that traditional portrayal of Israel as, the perpetual underdog, weak and besieged in its early years. Well, for instance, Benny Morris, a prominent Israeli historian often linked to this school, explicitly refutes the tenacious myth that the Zionists were badly outnumbered and outgunned in the 1948 War of Independence. He states flatly that Israel actually had significant advantages in manpower and weaponry over its Arab opponents.
Advantages? That's not the usual story.
No. The authors cite Morris, Avi Shleim, other Israeli historians to argue Israel was militarily stronger than its Arab adversaries right from the start. They even quote Yigal Yadin, a senior commander in 48, saying that without the British presence, they could have quelled the Arab riot in 1 month. Suggests the strength often downplayed.
And what about later wars like 1967 or 1973? Does the book challenge those narratives too?
It does. It argues that the Arab states in both the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War were pursuing limited aims, primarily trying to regain territories lost in 67, and were not, despite the popular narrative, aiming for the complete destruction of Israel.
Not aiming for destruction.
That's the argument. Again, they quote Benny Morris, who stated, Presidents Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Hafez Assad of Syria sought to regain the territories lost in 1967. Neither aimed to destroy Israel. This challenges that perception of constant existential threat, which is often used to justify Israel's actions.
Okay. The book also looks internally at how Israel treats its Arab citizens.
Yes. It points out that Israel, while founded as a Jewish state and also a democracy, treats its 1.36 million Arab citizens, who are citizens but not Jewish, as de facto second-class citizens.
How does it support that claim?
It cites a 2003 Israeli government commission, the Or Commission, which explicitly found neglectful and discriminatory behavior towards Arab citizens in areas like budget allocation, education, housing. This finding from an official Israeli body presents a stark contrast, the authors argue, to the liberal democratic values often emphasized in the U.S.-Israel relationship.
And there were polls mentioned too, about attitudes within Israel.
Yes, and the findings cited in the book are quite stark, painting a picture of deep internal divisions. A March 2007 poll, for example, found 55% of Israeli Jews wanted segregated entertainment facilities.
Segregated facilities?
Yes. Even more striking, over 75% said they wouldn't live in the same building as an Israeli Arab. More than half considered marriage to an Arab as national treason. And 50% said they'd refuse a job if their immediate boss was an Arab.
Wow. Those numbers.
They're startling. And these statistics, gathered within Israel, illustrate a significant societal divide that, for the authors, challenges the idea of purely shared democratic values in the way Americans might understand them. It prompts a critical look at the domestic reality.
Okay, now the book makes a very strong claim about the founding of Israel itself, that it involved, crimes against Palestinians.
Yes, this is one of the most controversial assertions in the book. The authors state, quote, the creation of Israel involved additional crimes against a largely innocent third party, the Palestinians.
That's incredibly strong language.
It is, and the book backs it with historical accounts, citing what it calls explicit acts of ethnic cleansing, including executions, massacres. It alleges some Zionist leaders back then explicitly advocated for brutal methods to remove Palestinians from their homes and lands during the 1948 war.
And they include a quote from Ben-Gurion.
Yes, a particularly stark and frankly disturbing quote attributed to David Ben-Gurion from his 1948 diary. He reportedly advocated for a strong and brutal reaction without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. There is no need to distinguish between guilty and not guilty.
That quote, It highlights a very different perspective on the founding than is usually presented.
It absolutely does. It illustrates the extreme measures considered and, according to the author, sometimes implemented during that period.
The book also mentions alleged massacres of Egyptian POWs.
It does, in 1956 and 1967, citing various sources. And it goes on to assert that Israel has systematically violated Palestinian human rights in the occupied territory since 1967, including, it claims, widespread use of torture against detainees.
And this isn't just the author saying this.
No, they note that prominent human rights organizations, including respected Israeli groups, have consistently documented these issues. They even quote 4 former heads of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, who condemned Israel's conduct during the Second Intifada as disgraceful and patently immoral. These details are woven through the book as evidence challenging Israel's moral standing.
And the 2006 Lebanon war comes up too.
Yes. The book discusses what it calls Israel's massive punishment of Lebanon's civilian population during that war, which followed actions by Hezbollah. The authors claim Israel deliberately destroyed critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, power plants, and killed over 1,000 Lebanese, the vast majority civilians.
And they deem this.
They deem this response both strategically foolish and a violation of the laws of war. They highlight reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch detailing widespread civilian deaths and destruction. Often, these reports claimed, without clear evidence that Hezbollah was using civilians as shields in most cases examined. This section aims to present a view of Israeli military conduct that, according to the authors, went beyond self-defense and incurred significant moral costs.
Okay, another striking point the book makes is about the use of terrorism by Zionist groups themselves.
Yes, it highlights that Zionist groups used terrorism as a tactic in the pre-state period, introducing bombings in buses and crowds in Palestine back in the late 1930s. They quote Benny Morris again, speculating that the Arabs may well have learned the value of terrorist bombings from the Jews.
It's provocative.
Extremely. And it names figures like future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, who, as a leader of the Lehi paramilitary group, openly argued, quote, neither Jewish ethics nor Jewish tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means of combat. This historical detail offers a very different perspective on the origins and definition of terrorism in the region, suggesting a more complex, less one-sided history.
Finally, on the moral front, the book tackles the no partner for peace narrative, the idea that Palestinian leaders always rejected peace.
Right, particularly the idea that Yasser Arafat consistently rejected peace offers. The book directly challenges this. It asserts that both Arafat and the Palestinians did accept the Clinton parameters back in 2000 as a basis for negotiation. Yes, with reservations, but crucially, the book notes, the Israeli government also had reservations.
So both sides had issues, but saw it as a basis.
That's the argument. And the authors state it was actually then Prime Minister Ehud Barak who ultimately broke off those talks, mainly due to internal political pressures within Israel, not because Arafat flat out rejected the deal. This significantly shifts the conventional narrative away from blaming only Palestinian intransigence for the failure of those talks.
Okay, so we've covered strategic and moral arguments. There's one more dimension the book explores: the religious justification for U.S. support.
Yes, this is an important piece of the puzzle they examine. The book acknowledges that for some evangelical Christians, particularly those known as Christian Zionists, there's a deeply held belief that Israel's establishment and continued existence is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
And this belief provides a powerful justification for support.
A very powerful moral and spiritual justification for unwavering support, yes.
Yeah.
And it often translates directly into significant political action and lobbying.
The book mentions a specific theological stream here: dispensationalism.
Dispensationalism, yes. And the Six-Day War in 1967 was absolutely pivotal for adherents of this belief system. They saw Israel's victory and expansion as a literal miracle of God, fulfilling specific prophecies within their interpretation of Christian end-times theology, where Israel plays a central role.
And this motivated them politically.
Deeply. The book explains it motivated dispensationalists to become much more politically involved, driven by a desire to make sure the U.S. was on the right side of these unfolding end-times prophecies. They quote Timothy Weber, a former seminary president, saying that after 67, they began to get down on the field and be sure the teams lined up right.
A striking image.
It is. It illustrates how these deeply held theological beliefs could translate directly into concrete political action, lobbying efforts, becoming a really significant force within the broader pro-Israel landscape in the U.S.
Okay, this brings us to what many see as the core of the book's argument: The detailed look at the composition and influence of what it calls the Israel lobby. This is where it gets really specific about how influence works, right?
Yes, this section meticulously details how the authors see this influence operating within the American political system. They move beyond just general statements to try and identify concrete mechanisms and actors.
And how do they define the lobby? It's not just one group, is it?
No, and they're careful about this definition. They define the lobby not by ethnicity or religion, but by its shared political agenda. They describe it as a loose coalition of individuals and organizations all working to steer U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction.
So defined by its goal, not its makeup.
Exactly. This frames it as a political actor with specific objectives, focusing on its actions and impact on policy, rather than making it about a particular ethnic or religious group. They're analyzing a lobbying effort.
And who are the key players in this coalition, according to the book?
Well, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, is described as the most important and best-known organization.
AIPAC. Everyone's heard of AIPAC.
Right. And to underscore its perceived power, the book cites Fortune magazine back in '97 and National Journal in 2005 both ranked AIPAC as the second most powerful lobby in Washington.
Second most powerful. Ahead of who?
Ahead of huge groups like the AFL-CIO Labor Federation, even ahead of the National Rifle Association, the NRA.
Oh.
And they quote former Congressman Lee Hamilton, a real veteran of D.C., calling AIPAC simply in a class by themselves. That paints a picture of truly exceptional influence.
Okay. Besides AIPAC, who else is mentioned?
Other influential groups include the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. That's kind of an umbrella group. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, known for civil rights work, but also strong pro-Israel advocacy. And the Zionist Organization of America, the ZOA, which is often seen as more hardline.
And Christian Zionists play a role, too.
A significant role, the book argues, and increasingly so. Groups like Christians United for Israel, CUFI, led by Pastor John Hagee, these groups often align very strongly with the lobby's core goals, and they bring a huge base of support financially, but also in terms of grassroots activism. It significantly amplifies the lobby's reach and political weight.
The book also mentions a kind of unity in diversity paradox. What does that mean?
It means that while acknowledging the lobby isn't monolithic, there are groups like Jewish Voice for Peace that are critical of Israeli policies and advocate for a two-state solution.
So there is internal debate.
There is some internal debate on specifics, yes. But the book argues that despite these differences, almost every pro-Israel group wants to keep the special relationship intact. There's this broad, overarching consensus on the core objective, maintaining robust U.S. support for Israel, even if they disagree on the exact policies or the best way to achieve that.
And the book suggests a very close link between some of these groups and the Israeli government itself.
It does, and this is quite telling. It notes that major Jewish organizations often seem to act almost as instruments of official governmental Israeli policy, echoing and amplifying positions taken by the government in Jerusalem.
Yeah, they provide evidence for that.
They quote Rabbi Alexander Schindler, a former chair of the Conference of Presidents, openly admitting back in 1976, "It was seen as our task to receive directions from government circles and to do our best no matter what to affect the Jewish community."
Wow. Receive directions.
And Hyman Bookbinder of the American Jewish Committee is quoted admitting even more bluntly, unless something is terribly pressing, you parrot Israel's line. These admissions, cited directly in the book, suggest a very strong, almost direct alignment of agendas, which challenges the idea of purely independent American advocacy on this issue.
Okay, let's talk tactics. How does the book say this influence is exerted? Campaign contributions come up.
Absolutely. Campaign finance is presented as a cornerstone. The book details how pro-Israel political action committees, PACs, are major political donors. Between 1990 and 2004, these groups reportedly contributed nearly $57 million to candidates and parties.
$57 million. How does that compare?
Well, the book contrasts that starkly with the less than $800,000 contributed by Arab American and Muslim PACs during the same period. This huge financial imbalance, the authors argue, gives the pro-Israel lobby considerable electoral clout. Money talks in politics.
And it's not just the PAC money itself.
No, it's the signaling effect, too. They quote Stephen Weiss from the Center for Responsive Politics, noting, If you are a candidate and you get the pro-Israel label from AIPAC, the money will start coming in from contributors all over the country.
Ah, so the endorsement unlocks a network of donors.
Exactly. It signals to a wide network that this candidate is considered good on Israel, generating substantial campaign funds. That's a powerful incentive for politicians to align themselves accordingly.
And what about the flip side? What happens to politicians who don't align or who criticize Israeli policy?
The book argues there are clear electoral consequences. It states bluntly that any senator or representative who crosses AIPAC is playing with fire, suggesting a real political risk involved in dissent.
Does it give examples?
It does. It mentions the defeats of former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, a Democrat from Georgia, and former Senator Lincoln Chafee, a Republican from Rhode Island, suggesting the lobby played a role and that its ability to impact elections was well known in political circles.
And they quote politicians on this.
Yes. Senator Ernest Hollings, a Democrat from South Carolina, is quoted with that very blunt remark from 2004. "You can't have an Israeli policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here."
What AIPAC gives you.
And former President Jimmy Carter said in 2007, it's almost politically suicidal for a member of Congress to take a stand seen as critical of conservative Israeli government policy. The book even includes an anonymous quote from a sitting senator saying 80% of their colleagues sometimes roll their eyes on certain votes, knowing it isn't what they think is right, but they don't want to get beat up on.
That paints a picture of a Congress where debate is constrained.
Significantly constrained by perceived political risks and the power of the lobby, according to the book's analysis.
Okay, so beyond direct political pressure, the book also argues the lobby shapes media coverage and public discussion.
Yes, this is another major area they explore. They argue that prominent columnists at major U.S. newspapers, they name names at places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, often show a strong pro-Israel bias, or at least very rarely take a pro-Palestinian stance.
Naming specific columnists.
Yes, people like William Safire, A.M. Rosenthal are described as passionate defenders of Israel. David Brooks as consistently defending Israel's position. Even Thomas Friedman, often seen as more moderate, is cited as almost never taking the Palestinian side in his columns. The argument is this creates a consistent narrative presented to the American public via influential media.
And a key tactic here, the book claims, is the suppression of dissent, using accusations of anti-Semitism.
This is a very sensitive but central part of their argument. They contend that critics of Israel or the lobby are frequently accused of anti-Semitism, and that this has a powerful chilling effect on open discussion and debate.
A chilling effect.
Yes. They quote Abraham Foxman, who is head of the ADL, saying it's naive to think the free market of ideas ultimately seeks falsehood to produce truth. The authors interpret this as implying a perceived need to actively control the narrative around Israel, rather than letting all ideas compete freely.
And they give historical examples of this.
They do. Back in the 1970s, they mentioned groups like Brera, an early Jewish American group, seeking dialogue with Palestinians being attacked and marginalized by mainstream Jewish organizations. More recently, in 2007, they cite an American Jewish Committee paper accusing liberal American Jews, including figures like Tony Kushner and Tony Judd, of effectively participating in a new anti-Semitism by criticizing Israeli policies.
So silencing internal dissent, too, not just external critics.
That's the argument. That these efforts aim to silence not just critics outside the Jewish community, but also internal Jewish dissent, often by labeling it as anti-Semitic or harmful to Israel, thereby stifling a more nuanced discussion even within the community itself.
The book also mentions a profound sense of fear among American Jews. How does that play into it?
It highlights this deep-seated fear, citing commentators who worried about a second Holocaust after some harsh criticism of Israel back in 2002. Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic is quoted observing this ethnic panic where death is at every Jewish door, fear is wild, reason is derailed.
And this fear is exploited.
According to the authors, yes. This genuine fear is then allegedly used as a smear tactic to shield Israel from legitimate policy criticism, deflecting debates about actions into accusations of bigotry, which effectively shuts down the conversation.
Does this influence extend into universities, into academia?
The book argues it does. It presents cases like Professor Juan Cole at Yale, a respected historian critical of Israeli policies, or former Congressman Pete McCloskey at Stanford, as examples of how pro-Israel groups have allegedly pressured academic institutions and individual scholars.
Pressure how?
Leading to scholars being denied jobs, having courses altered, facing professional attacks if their views deviate from preferred pro-Israel narratives. The argument is this limits academic freedom and critical inquiry on this specific topic.
And think tanks are mentioned, too, as another avenue of influence.
Yes, the funding and influence of think tanks is meticulously detailed. The Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution is a key example. Established in 2002 with a huge $13 million grant, largely from Haim Sabin, an openly ardent Zionist.
And Sabin was quoted about his focus.
Famously quoted telling the New York Times, "I'm a one-issue guy and my issue is Israel." This direct funding from individuals with such a clear, declared agenda, the authors argue, shows how seemingly independent research and policy recommendations can be shaped to reflect specific pro-Israel viewpoints, influencing the wider policy debate from within the respected intellectual establishment.
Okay, and the book even mentions surveillance.
Yeah.
By the ADL.
Yes, it mentions reports that the ADL engaged in surveillance of groups critical of Israel, including Arab American organizations. This apparently led to a civil suit and a settlement.
What was the ADL's defense?
According to its head, Abraham Foxman, as cited in the book, such actions were part and parcel of the safety and security and survival of the Jewish people. This suggests a proactive, sometimes controversial approach to monitoring perceived threats, even within the U.S., which critics argue blurs the line between advocacy and questionable intelligence gathering.
Finally, the book directly tackles that very sensitive charge, dual loyalty. How did the authors handle that?
Carefully. They firmly reject any suggestion that Jewish Americans are disloyal citizens. They state emphatically they are among the most patriotic and loyal Americans.
Okay, so they reject the smear.
Absolutely. However, they argue it is entirely legitimate, as a matter of political analysis, to point out that organizations like AIPAC are not neutral, and that the individuals running them are often motivated by an attachment to Israel that is bound to shape their thinking. Acknowledging this motivation, they say, is clear-eyed analysis, not an accusation of disloyalty.
And they quote people from the lobby being open about this.
Yes, and this is striking. Malcolm Homeland of the Conference of Presidents is quoted being quite transparent. "I devote myself to the security of the Jewish state." And Pastor John Hagee of CUFI is quoted stating, "The law of God transcends the laws of the United States government and the U.S. State Department."
That's remarkably open.
It is. And this transparency from within the lobby itself, highlighted in the book, is something for you to consider. It openly acknowledges a primary allegiance or motivation that might, the authors suggest, sometimes diverge from stated U.S. policy or broader American interests. It's key evidence for their argument about the lobby's motivations.
Okay, so moving beyond general influence, the book argues the lobby actively shapes specific U.S. foreign policy decisions, directing American power towards certain goals.
Yes, exactly. This section argues it's not just about maintaining aid levels. It's about actively pushing for particular interventions, specific geopolitical stances, influencing the very direction of American engagement in the Middle East, particularly regarding Israel's perceived adversaries.
Let's start with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The book claims the lobby played a role there, especially after 9/11.
It does. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the book notes, the Bush administration initially wanted to reduce anti-American sentiment in the region. One idea was to press Israel on its expansionist policies in the territories and actively push for a Palestinian state. The thinking was that progress on this issue could help build the anti-terror coalition.
But that didn't happen.
According to the book, no. It contends that then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon directly defied President Bush's calls for withdrawal during Israeli incursions into Palestinian areas in 2001-2002.
Defied the U.S. president.
Yes, and Sharon reportedly even likened Bush's pressure to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement at Munich, a deeply provocative comparison, suggesting Sharon felt he, and by extension Israel, could resist U.S. pressure, perhaps supported by the lobby.
And the book talks about U.S. officials feeling undermined. Colin Powell.
Yes, it vividly recounts the perceived humiliation of senior officials, especially Secretary of State Powell. His 2002 trip to the region, aimed at getting a ceasefire, was met with a barrage of attacks from neoconservatives in the media. David Brooks called it a disaster. Powell himself later described those days as 10 of the most miserable days imaginable.
Wow. Highlighting the lobby's perceived power to shift policy even against the Secretary of State.
That's the implication. Brent Scowcroft, former national security advisor, even declared later that Sharon had President Bush wrapped around his little finger.
And this wasn't just media pressure. Congress got involved too.
Yes. The book describes pro-Israel groups rallying in D.C., putting significant public and congressional pressure on the administration not to pressure Israel. They even got Congress to pass a $200 million aid package for Israel against explicit White House opposition.
Demonstrating real legislative power, even over the president.
Exactly. Underscoring its ability to influence Congress directly, even contrary to the executive branch's stated goals.
What about the roadmap for peace that Bush proposed?
The book asserts Sharon had no interest in negotiating a real two-state solution then, and publicly dismissed the roadmap, which aimed for a Palestinian state by 2005, as irrelevant.
And the lobby's view.
Heads of key lobby groups like Foxman at ADL and Hoenlein at the Conference of Presidents reportedly saw it as a roadmap to nowhere and actively worked to neutralize any U.S. pressure behind it. The book presents this as a clear alignment between the lobby and the Israeli government in undermining peace efforts they disliked.
The book also mentions Olmert's later plan for unilateral withdrawal failing.
Yes, Olmert's convergence plan for unilateral withdrawal from parts of the West Bank failed, leading him back towards emphasizing a negotiated solution. The authors use this to illustrate the limits of unilateralism for Israel and argue that without sustained external engagement or pressure, peace efforts tend to stall.
And the book claims pro-Israel forces within the Bush administration actively undermined later peace efforts by Secretary Rice.
Yes, particularly pointing to neoconservatives like Elliott Abrams in the White House. The book alleges Abrams and others systematically undermined any prospect for serious negotiations by Rice, ensuring a hardline approach remained dominant and effectively closing off diplomatic paths.
Okay, now for a really big one, the Iraq War. The book makes the bold argument that the lobby was a critical factor in the decision to invade in 2003. Not the only factor, but a critical one.
Yes, this is a major and highly controversial part of their thesis. A strong claim, and they marshal specific evidence to argue for a direct link between the lobby's agenda and this huge shift in U.S. policy.
How did they build that case? What was Israel's view on Iraq?
The book documents Israel's long-standing concern about Saddam Hussein's Iraq, going back to the 1981 bombing of the Osirak reactor. It then shows top Israeli officials like Shimon Peres and Benjamin Netanyahu publicly and strongly advocating for Saddam's removal in the lead-up to 2003, often linking him to a nuclear threat. Sharon himself said in 2001, before 9/11, that Iraq was a greater threat than Iran. This consistent message from Israeli leaders aligned perfectly with the push for war in Washington.
And the book singles out neoconservatives within the lobby.
Yes, it points to neoconservatives within the lobby as the principal driving force behind the war push. Figures like Douglas Faith and Richard Pearl are highlighted. They were authors of that 1996 Clean Break study for Netanyahu.
A clean break study. What did it say?
It explicitly advocated regime change in Iraq as an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, clearly stating its benefit for Israel's security.
And these individuals then pushed this inside the Bush administration.
That's the argument. Many of them had close ties to pro-Israel groups like Jinsa or ZOA, and they then aggressively pushed this agenda inside the administration, notably influencing Vice President Cheney, who had previously opposed regime change in Iraq.
The book describes them as obsessed.
Yes, obsessed with removing Saddam from power. They quote a senior administration figure saying, "It's almost a religion." Colin Powell apparently came back from meetings rolling his eyes about the fixation about Iraq. This fervor, the book argues, permeated the decision-making process.
And was there broader support within the pro-Israel community?
The book states that, yes, mainstream Jewish groups and leaders were now among the strongest supporters of an American invasion, acknowledging that concern for Israel's safety, rightfully factored into the deliberations of these groups, suggests a broad consensus backing the war, seeing Saddam's removal as beneficial to Israel.
The book also pushes back against counterarguments, that Israel wasn't really pushing for it.
It does. It explicitly refutes claims by figures like David Horowitz of the Jerusalem Post or Martin Kramer of YNAB, who argued Israel didn't really mobilize for the war or saw Iran as the bigger threat then. The book insists top Israeli officials were doing everything in their power to make sure that the United States went after Saddam.
And they mention Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile leader.
Yes, detailing how Chalabi, a key lobbyist for the invasion, specifically promised to foster good relations with Israel and rebuild the old Haifa-Mosul oil pipeline, an appeal that really resonated with pro-Israel war proponents. This actively challenges narratives downplaying Israel's or the lobby's role.
Okay, from Iraq, the analysis moves to Syria. The book argues Syria has been disproportionately targeted by the U.S., again due to lobby influence.
That's the argument, that Syria, which could have potentially been a partner on some issues, was instead pushed into isolation and confrontation, seemingly driven by the lobby's agenda rather than broader U.S. interests.
And the root issue with Syria, according to the book, is
The Golan Heights. Territory Israel seized from Syria in 1967 and effectively annexed in 1981. The book identifies this as the absolute core of the conflict. Syria remains deeply committed to getting it back.
and Syria's support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. How does the book explain that?
It argues Damascus supports these groups primarily as the only levers it has to pressure Israel into returning the Golan Heights. It's presented as a strategic calculation by Syria to gain leverage, not necessarily inherent hostility on other fronts. Suggests a path for engagement if the Golan issue were addressed.
But Israel opposed negotiating with Syria, especially under Sharon.
Strongly opposed negotiating, yes. And the book argues this Israeli opposition, communicated through the lobby, led the Bush administration to isolate and put pressure on the Assad government. This happened even though Syria had fought alongside the U.S. in the 1991 Gulf War and had okay relations in the 90s when the U.S. was trying to broker Syria-Israel peace deals. The shift, the book claims, was heavily influenced by Israeli preferences.
And the Syria Accountability Act, the sanctions.
Despite President Bush's initial reluctance, seeing Syria as a potential counterterrorism partner, the lobby, with AIPAC's full support, successfully pushed the Syria Accountability Act through Congress in 2003. Imposed significant sanctions. The book presents this as a direct result of the lobby's full court press, showing its legislative clout even against executive branch preferences.
And some neoconservatives wanted even more military action.
Yes, the book notes figures like Merov Wormser were reportedly angry. Israel didn't fight Syria directly during the 2006 Lebanon war, seeing Syria as the real enemy. Highlights a persistent hawkish stance pushing for confrontation, maybe even regime change in Damascus.
Okay, finally Iran. The book makes a strong case here too, right? That the lobby has pushed a confrontational U.S. policy, maybe against U.S. interests.
Yes, a very strong and detailed case. Arguing the lobby has consistently pushed for confrontation, often blocking diplomatic opportunities that might have served U.S. interests better.
When did Israel start focusing on Iran as the main threat?
The book notes Israeli leaders began warning Washington about Iran being a grave threat around 1993, right after the Soviet Union collapsed. This shift in focus, post-Cold War, aimed to redefine Israel's strategic value to the U.S. now as a bulwark against Iran, ensuring its continued importance to American security planning.
And the Clinton administration's dual containment policy.
According to the book, that policy containing both Iran and Iraq was heavily influenced by Israeli requests. It notes the policy was actually formulated at YNEP, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a pro-Israel think tank, by Martin Indyk. And it wasn't just containment, it explicitly aimed for dramatic changes in Iran's behavior, setting a confrontational tone early on.
And the book gives examples of the lobby blocking attempts at U.S.-Iran engagement.
Compelling examples, yes. In 1995, Iran tried to improve relations by choosing an American oil company, Conoco, for a major deal. President Clinton killed the deal, the book states, after strong opposition from figures like Edgar Bronfman Sr. of the World Jewish Congress and AIPAC. A direct intervention that stopped an Iranian overture.
And the grand bargain offer from Iran in 2003.
Even more significant, Iran, under the reformist President Khatami, made this comprehensive offer via Swiss diplomats, proposed talks on its nuclear program, ending support for Hamas and Hezbollah, accepting a two-state solution on 67 borders, all in exchange for ending sanctions and military threats.
That sounds huge. What happened?
The book states this astonishing offer was largely ignored by the Bush administration. Why? Due to the influence of neoconservatives and others in the lobby who preferred regime change over diplomacy, a potentially monumental missed opportunity, according to the authors.
And the push for military action against Iran's nuclear program.
The book asserts Israel and the lobby are the central forces today behind all the talk about using military force to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. And they argue this constant military threat actually makes it harder, not easier, to stop Iran getting the bomb by fueling Iranian nationalism and pushing them to pursue nukes for defense.
And there was a recent example from 2007 of legislative influence.
Yes, very recent for the book's publication. AIPAC successfully lobbied against a popular congressional measure that would have required the president to get explicit congressional approval before attacking Iran.
So keeping the military option easier to use.
Effectively, yes. keeping it on the table without that extra congressional check. Congressman Capuano and Kucinich both publicly blamed AIPAC for removing that provision, illustrating the lobby's direct, potent influence on legislation impacting war powers.
Okay, so if the book's analysis is right, that current policy isn't serving U.S. interest, what alternatives do Mearsheimer and Walt propose? They don't just critique, right?
No, they definitely offer a different path forward, a distinct vision for U.S. policy in the region.
What's the starting point? U.S. leverage.
They argue the U.S. has enormous potential leverage over Israel, much more than is usually acknowledged or used. They suggest Washington could credibly threaten to cut off support, economic, diplomatic, or even rally international pressure to isolate Israel, maybe like South Africa was over apartheid. This implies a power dynamic that's currently unused, in their view.
And strategically, they advocate for
A return to offshore balancing, which they describe as America's traditional grand strategy before the heavy interventions of recent decades.
offshore balancing. What does that involve?
Essentially, maintaining influence from afar, using naval and air power, diplomacy, supporting local allies, rather than deploying large ground forces or getting deeply entangled in regional conflicts. Balancing regional powers against each other instead of direct heavy intervention. A major shift from recent policy.
And what would that mean in practice for the Middle East, according to the book?
Several key reversals. Withdraw from Iraq quickly. Push Israel to return the Golan Heights to Syria, which, they argue, would then lead Syria to cut support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Actively seek a diplomatic deal with Iran instead of preventive war.
A whole different approach.
Completely. Aiming to isolate extremists, drive wedges between adversaries, encourage cooperation by addressing what they see as the root causes of instability rather than through military intervention.
And on the Israeli-Palestinian issue,
Yeah.
what's the proposed path?
The book proposes the U.S. should lean hard on Israel to accept a viable Palestinian state based roughly on the Clinton parameters from 2000.
Which would mean significant Israeli concessions.
Yes. On territory, Jerusalem, maybe refugee return points the authors admit are widely opposed in Israel today. They argue that without strong U.S. pressure, Israel simply has no incentive to make those necessary compromises.
And they argue this is actually better for Israel's security, too.
Counterintuitively, yes. They argue Israel is actually more secure now, militarily, than it was back in 1967 when it first occupied the territories. Its defense budget dwarfs its neighbors. It has nukes. So continued occupation, they contend, actually creates insecurity by fueling Palestinian resentment and regional instability.
So ending the occupation would make Israel safer.
That's the argument. It would deprive Iran of local sympathizers, turn groups like Hamas from perceived heroic defenders into just rejectionist terrorists, making them easier for everyone, including Israel, to contain because they'd lose broader popular support.
And the book brings up an ethical argument here, too, about Israel's founding versus its actions.
Yes, a crucial ethical point underpins their analysis. They acknowledge Israel's creation was a response to horrific Jewish persecution, especially the Holocaust, giving it a strong moral case for existence. However, they argue one cannot ignore the fact that the creation of Israel involved additional crimes against a largely innocent third party, the Palestinians.
So complex moral calculus.
Exactly. They contend that while historical crimes against Jews justify Israel's existence, its own alleged crimes against Palestinians undermine its claim to special treatment and unquestioning U.S. support. It's a crucial, difficult distinction they draw, moving beyond a simple narrative.
Okay, finally, the book considers how the lobby's influence might be lessened. How could that happen?
It's a tough challenge given the dynamics they describe, but they do offer some thoughts.
Like what? Campaign finance.
Public financing of elections is presented as the obvious way to reduce the lobby's influence. The idea is it would weaken that direct link between contributions and politicians' decisions. This, they hope, would allow for more open deliberations, letting officials focus more on broader U.S. interests without fearing financial or electoral backlash.
What about creating a counter-lobby to balance things out?
They're cautious about that. They say creating a direct counter-lobby is hard, given the Israel lobby's existing strength and the intense single-issue focus of its supporters, which is difficult to match. Plus, they express grave misgivings about an explicitly anti-Israel lobby, fearing it could unintentionally foster genuine anti-Semitism. They want to distinguish policy criticism from bigotry.
So maybe change comes from within the pro-Israel community itself.
That's a possibility they raise. The book points to what it sees as signs of growing disenchantment within the American Jewish community with the very hardline positions of some major organizations. It notes the increasing visibility of groups like the Israel Policy Forum, Brit Tzedek v'Shalom, Americans for Peace, now groups advocating for a two-state solution.
And these groups might merge.
They mention these groups were reportedly pondering a merger designed to enhance their influence. This suggests a potential for internal change, maybe a more organic shift in dynamics that could reshape the broader pro-Israel landscape in Washington over time.
So wrapping up, what this book lays out for you is, well, a really challenging examination of a deeply complex and incredibly sensitive topic.
It really is. It pushes you, the listener, to consider different perspectives on history, on how influence works, on how we even define national interest. It definitely compels critical thinking about the information we get and the narratives that shape our understanding of global events.
It urges a reevaluation of long-held assumptions about one of America's most enduring and debated foreign policy relationships. And that's our look into The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. As we've discussed, the book offers a provocative, detailed argument. It asserts that the largely unconditional special relationship between the U.S. and Israel isn't really defensible anymore on purely strategic grounds, and that its main driver comes from domestic political dynamics here in the United States.
It's essentially a call for a different kind of conversation, one that the authors clearly feel has often been stifled or shut down in public discourse.
So, as you consider the arguments and the evidence presented within this book, and remember, we've aimed to present the book's case objectively. Here's a final thought to ponder. In our increasingly interconnected world, with geopolitical sands constantly shifting, what truly defines a nation's interests? And maybe more importantly, how openly are we as citizens really prepared to discuss and debate the powerful, often unseen forces that shape those interests and the policies that follow?